the bailout increase. Again, trying to raise, let's not necessarily bail out the banks. It might be that nationalization is better. But you begin to see through the text analysis the actual fact that you have particular sites. Now, the interesting thing that's here is it does two things. The first thing is it gives us an opportunity to say we have a way. I was about to say, almost said objective, but then I succeeded in dropping the word. A way of identifying a site that is genuinely different along this dimension from other sites. We have an algorithm, it spits back out to us, what is it that is typical of this place relative to other blogs, relative to other newspapers. So at least it gives us some anchoring for why it is that we looked at Swedish, rather than that we just picked up whatever we thought would make a good anecdote. And that's not irrelevant when you're trying to actually validate your research and ground it in something like measures that are acceptable within political science. Then we saw it on Talking Points memo. I was getting very excited because here I saw suddenly an example of exactly what I thought would happen. Brad DeLong says it's a better option than the Paulson model bailout nationalization. I'm curious what Krugman thinks. Paul Krugman, obviously, is who he's talking about. So here I found my piece of evidence where something from the periphery along the attention backbone that I was able to map found that the major blogs find the smaller blog. It's all perfect. It's exactly as I had argued. Isn't that wonderful? And there's Krugman. Here's the piece of proof. Brad DeLong says the Swedish-style temporary nationalization. Proof. With one problem. We built the machine too well. Because now we can actually go back and use our data to create a timeline of these differences. And what do I find with this timeline? That it was Krugman to begin with after all. Here it is. It turns out 2 weeks earlier, Krugman and DeLong actually have an exchange where Krugman raises the possibility of the Swedish plan in the New York Times. DeLong immediately jumps on it and does an analysis and points back to it. And only then it gets re-emerged on his blog 2.5 weeks later. So what we get is a much more complex relationship between where things emerge, how they get sustained and developed, how they get brought back onto the agenda, and a relationship that is neither the blogs just amplifying what mainstream media says, nor the blogs are entirely the source of the agenda, but a more complicated relationship. Now, I don't know when we do many of these what we'll end up finding. But the point that I want to emphasize in this context is that what we get here are the beginnings of a tool that combines text analysis with human analysis, with historical timeline, with visualization, although this is about as crude a visualization as ever I've seen, to be able to actually begin to answer these questions of who has power to set the agenda. Just a short illustration. This is doing the same thing instead of on bailout on Gaza at the beginning of January. The interesting finding here from my perspective is that Al Jazeera ends up becoming almost as visible as the New York Times during that period. Back to the question of what happens and where does news come from globally once you actually eliminate all of the smaller scale unsuccessful newspapers. It's not that people don't have sources of information. It's just that you have a small number of global players that become the go-to place. And so around this time, you see a real bump in Al Jazeera, which generally speaking is I should have had the Washington Post here as well, fairly well read in that regard. You also see a bump up of another academic called Juan Cole, who's an interesting Michigan professor also. And this is what is this? Oh, this is the New Republic and Foreign Affairs, give you the calibration of visibility relative to Juan Cole. So he's going to be, around the time of Gaza, he becomes roughly visible like the New Republic and substantially more than Foreign Affairs. Again, not a trivial anecdote to find when you're able to find in the data that a particular site has become very important at a particular moment. Here, what I want to just exhibit is that tag clouds help us, but that it's important not to be confused by big letters. What do I mean by it's important not to be confused by big letters? The biggest words are going to be uninteresting. Everybody's going to talk about it. It's the smaller words and the mid-sized words that give you some insight, because these are the words that are typical of that particular site relative to another. So if you look, for example, at Fox News, at what they're talking about when they talk about Gaza is they talk about peace, they talk about propaganda, and they talk about security. If you compare this, for example, to the New York Times, you see suddenly mention of children, mention of water, and you can extract from that a certain set of reporting that's more concerned with casualties, that's more concerned with water supplies, and things like that. You can begin to see, as you see at the lower level, different levels. Then you compare that to Juan Cole, you see a completely different model. You see points of apartheid, you see emphasis on Hezbollah and Lebanon. You also see the reference to ethnic. We can actually click through these words to see where they're used. So actually, what it turns out is he's both talking about ethnic cleansing and about ethnic nationalism. Very interesting article, this one, on the problem of ethnic nationalism and its relationship to the conflict. But again, this begins to give you a bit of a grasp on how different speakers are different in their perspectives. Or another representation of the same data is to see how the New York Times and Fox News, looking at the lower levels, focus very much on Israel, on Olmert, Jerusalem, Barak, whereas Informed Comments focuses much more on regional concerns, on Iraq, on Lebanon, on Iran. And then suddenly you see them separate, as opposed to if you're looking just as Israel, Hamas, they look roughly similar. So again, different mechanisms for text analysis to try to actually identify differences. This is another text analysis from Feminista from the same period, a feminist blog, a group feminist blog. Interesting, but not as insightful, because what you end up getting here is a very interesting sort of self-searching, soul-searching of a Jewish feminist about what she understands herself in relationship to Gaza, in relationship to discrimination within Israel between Jews, different kinds of foci. But the point is, you get to begin to observe very different kinds of sites and how they respond to a certain set of materials that simply would have been invisible before. And again, just to show this is not an invisible space, this is Feminista relative to Brad DeLong, which we saw. So again, this burstiness of, at some periods, Brad DeLong is higher, at some periods, Feminista is higher, embedded in a different set of connections, but nonetheless having the same characteristic of over time, not just once having their 5 minutes in the media, but over time being observable under certain conditions. Calls to action. We talked about this, so this is just the difference between calls to action on left and right. We talked about this and about the fact that it changed the role of the blogosphere in the Democratic Party. The biggest example of this was when the Netroots essentially mounted a campaign against Senator Lieberman from Connecticut and got him to lose the Democratic nomination, but he ran and won anyway as an independent. We talked about Act Blue. I'll skip Stolen Honor in the interest of, no, if I have 5 minutes, I can do both. I'll just talk quickly. Sorry. So, I was talking quickly up till now? So, in 2004, in the run-up to that election, Sinclair Broadcasting, which was the major broadcasting owner of many of the network affiliates in most of the battleground states, was going to run essentially an hour-long smear documentary propaganda piece against Kerry. It was called Stolen Honor. and it was about smashing his Vietnam career.